Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining RUSHES 3. This is the third iteration of a series of RUSHES conversations initiated by Savvy Contemporary, the art space in Berlin. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And I would like to say, please bear with us before we start with any technical failures or any technical difficulties. Technology will fail us. It does fail us by design. This is part of our conversation today, so please consider it as part of the total experience. I would like to start by thanking the Savvy team for putting this together and for inviting us to curate and moderate this session. And I would like to thank also the NAAS team, Erika and Furad. My name is Jowe. I also work with NAAS, the Network of Arab Alternative Screens, a network of more than 20 alternative cinema initiatives in more than 11 Arabic-speaking countries. And I would also like to welcome our speakers. Thank you so much for joining. I really have the pleasure to be in conversation with you tonight. I will start by introducing you one by one, and then I will direct questions or certain prompts directly to you. Please remember to unmute before speaking. I will start by introducing Rana Yazaji. Rana is a researcher and a trainer and works in cultural management in general. Rana was previously the director of Al-Mawrid Al-Thaqafi, cultural resource, and is also one of the founders of Ittijahat. Rana published a number of research projects and studies, the last of which is on arts and funding, and it's titled Arts and Funding, Models of Resource Management and Parallel Approaches to Cultural and Creative Sustainability. We're very happy to have you with us. Thank you for making the time. Then we have with us also Leil Zahra Mortada, who is a transfeminist queer researcher and filmmaker. Leil's work is at the intersection of digital security, human rights, art, and activism, and is also part of several independent media groups such as Musirreen in Egypt and Indie Media in Lebanon. And they've also worked as a project lead for Data and Activism, an applied research project that looked at the digital security and human rights. And then we have Yazan Khalili with us, who is an artist and cultural producer. Yazan was previously the director of the Sakakini Cultural Center in Ramallah, Palestine, and is the co-founder also of Radiohara, a recent project that emerged during this moment of lockdown this year. Yazan is currently the co-chair of the photography department of the MFA program at BARD, and is also a PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam. I don't know, guys, how you do all these things at the same time. It brings us, last but not least, to Jowe Shea. Very pleased to have you with us also. Jowe is a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, focusing on digital rights, information controls, and the impact of technology across the Arabic-speaking region. Jowe's research examines the political, legal, and economic context of network filtering, monitoring technologies, and digital media manipulation, all of which are extremely urgent topics to discuss, and all of which I understand not much about, which is why I think this conversation is quite, for me, essential and vital. We are positioning our discussion at the intersection of digital security, digital rights, and the digital ecosystem at large with arts and culture, cultural policy, and our artistic and cultural practice in general. I would like to start by saying that this panel will be in English, but also if you feel called to speak in Arabic or whatever other language you're comfortable in, there's going to be a subtitling for this panel later on, and we will republish it with subtitles. So please don't feel obliged to speak in English or limited to any language choice. And also, last comment before we begin, there will be a question section at the end. So we are hoping to limit our conversation to an hour maximum and leave half an hour at the end for your questions. Since this is a live broadcast, this is the first Rushes session to be live. The previous two have been pre-recorded. So interaction from everyone watching is highly encouraged. Please leave your questions on Facebook Live and we will make sure to answer them at the end. Also in any language you feel comfortable with. So, it's a very large topic. I am not sure how to access it. Let's say that we are looking at this moment where the fierce digitization of our cultural work and artistic practice has become inevitable. It has begun to become inevitable through the past years, but now it seems that everyone is either rushing to produce online content, is struggling a little bit with online channels for disseminating their work, but also for reaching audiences. So we would like to dissect a little bit the very large topic of cultural policy through the lens of the online move. Last month, there was a very interesting panel that I saw online, Pandora's Box talk. It was produced by Al-Mawrid Al-Thaqafi, Cultural Resource, and it was also moderated and curated by two of NAAS members, Sudan Film Factory and Action for Hope. And Jihan Al-Tahiri was one of the speakers on the panel. She is the director of DocsBox, among many other attributes and many other things, the hats that she wears. And she called for the need she felt for us as a sector to map out our digital move a little bit, to have more conversations around it. So this is kind of in line with all the panels that have been happening around cultural policy and the struggle that is very evident and clear around the vocabulary and the issues that have become really inevitable with the digitization and the online move. I guess my question at first would be, seizing this moment, we're going to look at limitations of this technology and we're going to look at opportunities that this moment presents. My first question would be, it's a very large question. Is it possible to unplug our cultural practice from the capitalist machine that we work under? Both offline, this question applies to both the offline technologies and methodologies and also the online. And if this online moment, is it possible that it would afford us a window or a margin for us to question and re-challenge the way we do things, rethink the way we do things? I mean, obviously, we are still working on the internet, which is an extremely centralized network. In its design, it presents big limitations and big challenges, especially for the arts and culture sector. But please feel free to address it from the offline perspective and the online perspective. So we have a larger perspective, larger view on the situation, and also try to see where do we find more possibilities and ideas for us to succeed, or to speak from, personal victories, small achievements that we see, the small possibilities that we see are feasible. Rana, can we go to you first?
I should remember to ask questions in advance. Actually, are we able to unplug our cultural practices when it comes to capitalist machine or system? I would hope. I mean, it's not. I don't have the answer. Can or can be able or not. I mean, I think it's a whole system, economically, socially, that we live, culturally, that we live. And the question is for me, what do we do to try to achieve this unplug? Whether we can or not, I mean, every choice in the institutional structure vision for our cultural activities, in the ideology and theories behind our cultural activity, in education choices, in everything we do. I think each of us has his or her understanding of what a good system is. It's a whole system. It doesn't work. I think that the difficult when we talk this sphere, in this political sphere, when we talk about culture as an isolated sector, it becomes very hard to imagine a more progressive cultural system. It's been more feasible for me when we talk about it as part of a bigger movement that includes actors, activists from other fields. If we talk about digitalization, I think one of the things that I've been thinking of since you invited me, Jowe, to this panel was to what extent it allows us to explore new kind of someone who is skeptical to acknowledging that we have this digital move, even though it's like our grandparents when they didn't under the TV, it's something like that. I mean, it's something that we use every day, but to use it as a replacement for reality, it's still something far from is a good thing for us. When we have to, in a situation, this is a crisis. So when we use it during a understand that, but to accept and acknowledge the idea that it's a new reality, it's kind of hard for me when it's completely replacing the reality that we know. So does it allow for re-questioning the cultural system, including how we create an alternative system that we are ethically with? Yes, it does. It does help. It has tools, but it does the thinking. The thinking we still have to bring in.
Thank you. I think you mentioned something extremely important, which is opening up to other sectors or other disciplines. So this cross-disciplinary, cross-sectorial approach is really important, especially when we're talking about networks of solidarity and this new economy of solidarity, which are really buzzwords right now. I would like to defer the question now to Yazan, if you would like to comment on this a little bit. What do these buzzwords mean? What is an economy of solidarity? What is technology of solidarity?
Okay. Yeah, I think, to begin with, with your question about can we unplug from capitalist mode of production or capitalist economies, I think we can, and I say that because it's essential that we think that we can, especially in relation to digital and online existence, because it's becoming part of our existence. To be alive is also to be online. in many of our economical and social structures. But this existence is conditioned by, like we are entering the online based on companies, corporations. Like we are, it's already capitalized existence, and therefore I think we have to keep imagining and producing, accumulating trials of 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 you know how do you negate the capitalist, uncapitalist, incapitalistic existences, and that happens by I think many trials, many imagination, many acts of solidarities, which happens by engaging with these kind of acts of imagination and acts of what do you call it, like affirmative action. Like you try to do things, you try to set examples, like it's based a lot on failures, but these failures accumulate small knowledges, experiments, know-hows that eventually become the backbone of the next experiment that we take in as individuals or as collectives or as institutions. So I think it's not a project. It's understanding life itself. It's not like, it's a project I want to do and withdraw from later. It's not, you can keep living without engaging with it. No, it's you are engaging with it anyway. And it's your political existence and political being that requires this kind of continuous trials and failures and successes. I'm not sure, but yes. I don't know if this answers this, or it fails in answering the question, but yeah.
It answers several questions at once, yes. But I think to build on what you're saying, I would like to recenter the conversation a little bit around the digital sphere and ask Jowe, as a first comment, maybe on the digital ecosystem. If it is a place, it is an adequate ecosystem where possibilities such as the political project and the political accumulation of experiences that live and breathe outside of capitalism are possible.
Yes, definitely. I think obviously this example is very tired now 10 years later, but I do think that 2011 was, the sort of first example of, the internet providing opportunities for mobilization across different socioeconomic classes and just new forms of discussion that resulted in widespread political changes. At the same time, though, I think that we should always be wary, and there's too much techno-utopianism that goes around. So I think we need to temper our expectations and recognize that tech is both things. It does provide the opportunity for alternative voices to be heard, for organizing that would not otherwise be possible to happen in contexts that are under extreme forms of authoritarianism and repression. But at the same time, those same technologies can be used by those authoritarians to prevent that kind of expression and to change the narrative and to manipulate it. And so I think if, when we're looking at the technology as a whole, and if we're thinking about cultural and artistic production happening exclusively online, in certain contexts, certain forms of political and artistic expression wouldn't otherwise be possible without the existence of the internet. If we're thinking of certain vulnerable communities in certain states that are not open to different kinds of identities. But at the same time, we need to be very aware that technologies can be used against those vulnerable communities. So if we're thinking about censorship, surveillance, even access to the internet, there's a huge digital divide around the world, particularly in the MENA region, and it's only been exacerbated by COVID. This digital divide as everything has gone online. Access to internet is hugely, tied along socioeconomic factors and demographic factors. So as education goes online, as work goes online, those opportunities again become so more less available to those folks who don't have basic internet access. So yes, I think we need to recognize the internet and digitization as both things. It presents opportunities, also huge drawbacks. And as you're having these conversations about social and cultural policy, you need to approach it with a sense of harmony and a strategy to try to reach those communities that wouldn't otherwise be able to be reached because of their lack of access. Also be planning for things like censorship and surveillance, and having good, strong digital security policies and plans in place, censorship, circumvention techniques from the publisher side and from the user side. So yeah, these are the kinds of things that I think we need to keep in mind as you're having these conversations.
Thank you, Joey. I think, it is pretty obvious that a hybrid model of online-offline in the arts and cultural work is inevitable. I would like to ask, maybe start with Leil, what do you think is moving online and what is never moving online? What do you keep missing from the artistic experience or the cultural experience that you think does not have a place to be replicated in digital arenas?
First, I think I want to quickly say something about what you said about the detachment from the big C. I was waiting to see who's going to say the capitalist word first. An important issue with these things, of course, I agree with what Joey said about these. There has been experiences about this, and Yazan mentioned some, and Rana as well. The thing is, these experiences do need money in the end of the day. These platforms that are being developed in an open source, safe, user-based experiences, they need money, they need sustainability from a financial perspective. People who are developing them, they need income. The question that I think it's important to address when we talk about detachment from the capitalist modes of production is how many of us as users are willing to pay for the services that we are using. Social media platform created this myth that we are using these services for free, like Facebook is for free, Twitter is for free. It's not for free. We're paying with our data, we're paying with our privacy, we're paying with basically our lives and our social dynamics. Even experiences that were based on pay what you can, allowing users to choose if they can afford paying or not, or how much money they can afford to pay, they also didn't manage to sustain, or in their majority, they didn't manage to sustain the projects for themselves. Now, going to what I feel is being lost is, first, the big question is it worth it to move to the digital sphere as cultural institutions, as cultural projects, as artistic practice? I feel recently there's this kind of fashion of we have to exist on the online. We have to go to the online, as if there's one solution that fits all. I don't believe there is one solution that fits all, especially when we're talking about the digital sphere. Would survive, would do better on the digital world, and some projects actually would not benefit from it. And now during COVID, I was very interested in looking at a lot of the streams, like whether they're music or film screenings or talks and panels, how many people are actually watching and how much revenue is being generated from these events. I feel sometimes people are more concerned about maintaining their presence in the public eye, despite the massive amount of effort and the massive amount of resources and cost that they're putting into being online, rather than in the actual revenue that they are getting. Like a lot of collectives, I keep hearing them, oh, we're moving online because we need to generate revenue. And then you look at how many people are watching and how many people are actually donating or buying the tickets, it doesn't really compute in my head. So I think we should ask these questions before we make these decisions.
Wonderful, Leil. I think you were referring, if I'm not mistaken, to like being mindful of this trap or this illusion of visibility for the sake of visibility, and also the illusion of the sense of community that is only limited to online platforms or online channels. I want to go to Rana, if possible. Leil mentioned a little bit the need for money, and my question to you is: do we really need money? I know your research in depth alternative economic models in the arts and culture sector, and you have looked into models of collective models of, for example, skill sharing, time sharing. Do you think it is possible? One, and is it possible online?
Is it possible to get money for the arts? That's
to not need money or to need less money, yes.
To need less money, yes, but not to need less resources. Anyways, this is what I believe in. It's for me. I mean, the study that you're referring to, Jowe, was exactly about that and about how we get these resources, and it came. I decided to do it because I've been working for so long in the institutional sector of the arts and culture, and I think we're kind of trapped in our economic system, in the cultural field. And here I'm talking about the MENA region. Of course, there are differences between countries. There are different cultural policies or different opportunities in each, or different challenges and catastrophes in each of the Arab countries. But still, there is a kind of something that we can talk about in general. The economic system of the culture for me was very challenging. The independent sector, the civil sector in the arts was growing since ever, but basically I'm talking about since 2011. It's mushrooming everywhere. New institutions, new collectives, new groups, new initiatives, new imagination, and new forms of collective and solidarity work is growing. But in the parallel, we still have the very traditional way of thinking when it comes to money. So we go to big donors, we apply for funding, we get funding, we do projects, and then give reports. The whole research was about finding alternative solutions for the resources. We need money, we need resources, and we don't only need it. I mean, this is a sector. This is not something that we enjoy only in the street, because a musician doesn't need to eat. I mean, we're professional, and this sector is one of the not only human sectors, but also economic sectors that needs resources. I think we can be more creative in how we collect these resources. The online, yes, provides some tools, but also what's important for me about the online is how we use it as a tool for more solidarity and collective kind of funding. I'm not only talking about the crowdfunding. That's the very typical thing that we talk about when we talk about the online thing. But there are many, many, many other online and offline forms of collecting resources. I think this is something that I can talk about for hours, so I don't want to take a lot of time. But here I'm not taking a position. I don't say that digitalization is a solution for the resources. I think we need to find strategies. We need to find creative models for our economy as a sector, as a whole, not as individuals or institutions, but as a sector. We need to recreate our sector. This is what I believe, including the economic bit, and use to the maximum the potentiality that we can create from the online.
Okay, amazing. I think we might need to talk for hours about the different sources of, finding resources or sourcing income for the sector, and also grant-making models and allocation of these resources, and the models that we follow for the distribution of these resources in more equitable ways amongst ourselves within the sector. Let me turn to you, Yazan, on this point, and perhaps refer specifically to Radiohara as a project. You have called it in our previous chat communal media. If you would like to talk a little bit more about the model and what this means, also like by maybe presenting Radiohara quickly.
Yeah. So Radiohara is a online radio. Like I think many radios have been coming out in the recent year, in this year, that we are also getting to know about and engaging with. It's how to describe it, like we are learning what is the radio, what is this platform while we are just running it. It's building the plane and flying it at the same time. So even the language to speak about it and to try to explain it, it's just developing with every time we have to speak about it, or we have to engage with a discussion about it. Otherwise it speaks for itself and speaks to us, and so we are learning from it as it goes. And this is and we began using the term communal media to describe it in a way to try to position it against social media, to try to find a kind of a language to be able to speak about it beyond its just beyond itself as just like one experiment, but to try to position it for experiments that are, or trials that are going online right now. So communal media, I think it's a platform that engages with the producers and gives a space to the community to share, to play, to broadcast their productions without any kind of algorithmic data mining. It has acts of collectivity through its linear time. So it's not an individual engagement. It's not tailored according to the individual who is listening or producing or engaging with this platform, but it takes a very maybe traditional form of media, which is you open the radio and whatever on it you listen to it. So it's not tailored to your own time and what you expect, and you can forward or return to the same media all the time. And it's based on people putting time, effort, and knowledge. So there's without actually barely no money involved in it. So it costs till now, I think, around $1,000 a year. Well, we haven't been a year yet, so maybe till now it cost us $600. So maybe when it becomes a year, we'll calculate, but it will not exceed $1,000. So it's nothing compared to the size and the impact that it had already. But that said, there is so much effort and time put in it by the community, either the producers that are sharing their time, either the community that is there to communicate and to speak, or the people, us, the people running it, to program, to do all the technical stuff that are related to it all the time. So there's so much put in it, but as Rana said, so there's so much resources being put, but not money only. So it doesn't live on financial support. It lives on communal support. And this, I was just like, until 3 months before we began Radiohara, I was working at the Sakakini Cultural Center, and there I was part of this trial to try to find a kind of a new kind of cultural economy, and to try to subvert certain economical structures that are related to art practices. But then engaging with Radiohara, I think, opened up the possibility to be able to create a cultural platform, a structure that can be engaging on many levels, but also independent and financially emancipated, if I would dare to say, on another level, which is totally, for me, it's really a new experience to have, and especially that we had so much impact till now. Like nothing, we had no plans at all. As we say in Arabic, دبتك العافية. Like we just we just like boom.
Subtitle this later, Yazan.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I don't know if it can be translated. Like you just fall. Yeah, it's just like you fall in the project, and that's it. And you don't do, and you don't plan much. You plan as you go. You change. It's so much discussions happening all the time between the team, between the community, and the community grows in an organic way. Really, there's so much space for mistakes that it's allowing it to be successful, and this is for me, this is the beauty of the experiment. There's no donor, no report, no one to tell us do this, do that, you did wrong, you didn't do it as planned. What happens with the donor economy, that you have to write a proposal, you have to already have a plan and to follow the plan, no? And this is so much pressure, because then you cannot learn from your experience. With such a project, we had no plan, and we are just learning from the experience itself. And it's so, in my life, in the cultural sector, I haven't had such a pleasure of working and producing, because no restrictions, except that we are having with the community and the discussions we have.
What I really like about what you're talking, the models you're presenting, and also with Rana's work and research, is this like constant challenging of the concept of sustainability. It's not that we do not want cultural projects or institutions or initiatives to be sustainable, but we are re-questioning what it means to be sustainable, away from a neoliberal definition of reproducing necessarily a business model or a sustainable as you said, like donor economy dependent dependent models or borrowing from the entrepreneurial sphere constantly. Rana, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to
Please.
make sure that at least to make sure that it's clear, at least for me, I'm not also talking about replacing totally this economy. I mean, we should also rethink the relation to this economy and diversify it. It's not either or. It doesn't work also without the system, because it's something. I'm talking about the funding coming from donors. I'm not saying we don't need donors. No one should take it this way. On the contrary, it's about diversifying our approaches rather than replacing them. On the opposite, I think we need to partner with the usual suspects. If we're talking about the MENA region, the donors who are supporting the cultural sector for years, who've done also great job. But I think we need to engage in a discussion with them about their role in the sustainability. We always have it as a part of the application. It's not a checkbox that we need to work on. It's a sustainability of a system, of a field, not of an institution or a project. And here the discussion is something that is really urgent, I think, at this point, with all the multiple crises that we're going through.
Absolutely, thank you. Leil?
Okay, I'm here comes the pessimist. First, I want to say that I'm a big fan of Radiohara. I'm not criticizing anything. I'm a huge enthusiast of the project and of the people working on it, and I'm a frequent listener. But I want to say something that I think sometimes we drop from the conversation, which is a capitalist definition, but we do live in a capitalist world and we do have bills to pay at the end of the month. The fact that time is money, time is equivalent to money. And even if we are not using money in the project, we are still putting time, and it raises questions of who are the people who can afford putting this time away from generating the money they need to pay their bills. And I'm not talking about Radiohara again, I'm talking about these experiences in general. For example, in Europe, in a period of time, the squatter movement had played an important role in providing a space for such collective initiatives, whether they're cultural or political, because they took away the rent money, they took away the bills, they took away like part of the bills, which is not possible in a lot of countries, especially in Arab majority countries. So this is a point that I wanted to raise, that when we're talking about sustainability of projects, we need to keep in mind that certain people, like for example, I'm privileged enough now to be able to afford to do projects that I like, or participate in communal projects that are beautiful and inspiring and whatever, because I can afford taking time off work because I've have my bills sorted month by month, but so far it's going well. So that's one point that I think we should keep in mind when we're talking about these things. Another thing, that's it. I'm not going to talk so much.
Thanks, Leil. I think, it's very important what you're saying, because on the individual level, I wanted to add on the structural level also that the same, what you call privilege on the individual level, it plays as power dynamics on the structural level. And in the absence of clear cultural policies from our governments in our countries, basically, whoever has this has a grant-making power has been, through their practice, kind of dictating what the cultural policies are, just by doing something, just by establishing a grant-making model, by establishing some kind of meritocracy-based grant-making models. I wanted to talk a bit more about NAAS's specific experience, but I see Yazan anxious to say something. Please, Yazan, go ahead.
Yes, because maybe I'm going to say something a bit long, because what Leil is saying is so accurate and so essential. First of all, the question of cultural production and its relation to money. I think culture becoming a paid practice is something that we don't need to take as granted. Like it's not something that we should consider as it has always been like that. This has been shifted in time, culture. I'm not talking about I'm saying culture as a public practice. People singing in weddings and sharing, like having their cultural life performed and practiced in the society has not been always connected to being in itself related to income generating or to live out from it. On one side, I'm not saying that there is no people who used to be paid to come to sing in weddings, for instance, or who lived out of that practice. So there is many ways to engage culturally in the society. That's just one point. But what had happened in the last 30 years, especially in Palestine, after Oslo, and Lebanon, maybe after the end of the civil war, this whole neoliberalization of the economy and the civil society and the establishment of these cultural institutions, that the cultural sector has dominated the cultural life. It became the only channel that represents culture in the society, and that you can only practice your culture through these kind of institutions. It produced the cultural working class, like the people who work and live out from culture. And that
monetization.
The monetization, but like it is, you work as a cultural producer, like this is your work in life. This is what you make money out from, and it at the same time kind of separated the intellectual from life. So you cannot think of a cultural producer to be the mechanic of your car, like a mechanic on one side, and the one who established the dancing group Fan al-Shabi in Ramallah, for instance, Abu Atta, who who had who lived out from one source but practiced culture collectively and produced these kind of collective actions of dance and music on the other side. But then, and this is what you see a lot, as if you cannot volunteer anymore in a structure that is based on volunteering. So why I think, for instance, at Sakakini, I could never ask people to volunteer because there is an economical structure in it. There is money coming in, there is budgets, therefore people need to be paid through it. But in Radiohara, where there's no money, it's a structure that has zero money being generated through it. It makes the idea of volunteering possible, like not only volunteering, but to participate with time and effort without expecting to be paid back, because there's no money here being added to the cycle of the cultural production. What I'm saying in this experiment of Radiohara and other experiments, like it's not the only one experiment, that there is a need for cultural spaces that have a different economical structure than cultural institutions and the economical structure of the cultural institutions. That we can engage publicly with cultural initiatives and within these cultural platforms, knowing that this is already outside of that economy. But we as individuals, we have to live from other resources. We have to teach, we have to work, we have to do to engage with the community, but not to be cultural producers as a job. We produce culture through being in the community. Yeah, I don't know if this answers something here, but I'm beginning to find this as a as a way to rethink how culture moves and can move in a community when the crisis is not a cultural crisis, but it's an institutional crisis. So to go beyond the crisis of the institution by creating or engaging with a communal structure that goes beyond the institution itself.
Thank you for mentioning the crisis institutions. Yeah, and I really wanted to discuss networks specifically as a model, and without going too deep into the institutionalizing of networks. This is a very large topic for another conversation. But I really like the idea of a crisis of institutions that you mentioned now. I would also like to link it back to this moment of crisis, or like public health crisis that we are living through. And my personal hope is that we see it as a crisis of systems, as a failure of systems beyond just a public health crisis. And networks, if we want to position networks as the title of this panel suggests, networks as technologies of solidarity, both online and offline, and think a little bit of the possibilities of alternative economies, of the decentralizing networks in the online sphere a little bit. Jowe, I'm going to go back to you to ask this question, maybe from a broader perspective. Please feel free to answer it the way you want. When Yazan was speaking, I was thinking of time banks, for example. I was thinking of the online platforms that allow for time sharing, skill sharing, resource sharing that goes beyond monetary currency transactions. But I was also thinking of networks or the possibility of more equitable, fairer practices online, and is that even possible on an internet that is quite central, quite monitored, quite censored?
I have a few thoughts, and sorry, finish your question, and then I'll go ahead.
Please,
I guess I want to respond maybe to begin with a few things that Yazan was bringing up. If we're talking about these different modes of cultural and artistic production that are outside of traditional economies, and particularly in this moment with COVID, where there are these intense pressures to produce online because we can't congregate together in real life. I think it's important to be aware, even if the structure of organizing may be outside of these traditional economies, you're going to need a platform. You're going to need to commune together through some sort of platform, and inevitably those platforms are part of these traditional economies, whether it's on Facebook or Twitter or even a platform that's lesser used. I think that even though you're not bringing in traditional economies into that scenario, someone else, which is these large social media companies based in Silicon Valley, are they're making money off of your data. You're basically the product. So I think that's important to keep in mind. In terms of just more directly to your question, Jowe, about sort of alternative, more non-hierarchical social networks. There have been some experiments with peer-to-peer networks. Mastodon was probably one of the most popular ones. But these, experiments do have problems. And one of the big ones is just not enough people end up going on them for there to be a critical mass of popularity. Unfortunately, Facebook has become what it is because it has X number of billion users on there now still, and with Facebook and Instagram as well. So, there have been these experiments, but they just haven't picked up in the way that I think a lot of the early sort of cyberpunks would have wanted them to be. And, there hasn't yet been this truly non-hierarchical network of networks, internet, that people were hoping for, 30 years ago, unfortunately. At the same time, though, if we're thinking just like in terms of opportunities, and particularly in MENA, in a country like Egypt, where cultural and political and economic production are so hard for alternative narratives, these spaces are really, really important, despite the censorship, despite the surveillance, despite the campaigns that to shift these narratives. At the end of the day, certain kinds of political expression just would not be possible in these circumstances, in these kinds of political contexts. So, I think it's important to look for alternative networks and to constantly, be striving for alternative forms. But at the same time, if we can have a sort of harm reduction strategy to platforms that are already popular and that are pre-existing, I think that's a good strategy. So, for example, Mada Masr, which is one of the last remaining independent media organizations in Egypt, they are blocked. They have an excellent publisher side censorship circumvention strategy, which is to launch a series of mirrors, and the state will block a mirror, and then they'll launch another one to circumvent it. And I think they're on their 25th or 26th mirror at this point. So, that's one strategy to get around state surveillance, but they do rely quite heavily on traditional platforms like Facebook and Twitter to reach an audience that has been taken from them because of the amount of times they've been blocked by the state, because their URL keeps, for people in Egypt, in order to access the website, their URL keeps changing. And so in order to sustain their readership and their base, they rely on social media, which is too expensive for the state to be blocked. So, I think when we're, looking at alternative platforms and networks and forms of organization, I think, that's important, but also to not, completely throw out larger scale platforms, and instead approach them with like a harm reduction strategy.
I love this concept of harm reduction. I kept thinking we want more information on the strategies that you research and that you are looking into. We want to learn more about it because it seems gatekeeping is inevitable somehow. It's being used. We know gatekeeping as a practice offline in our cultural practice, but also online. You were talking about the hegemonic platforms that function as hi, Kat. That function as gatekeepers, basically. And I kept going back to this idea of peer-to-peer that you also mentioned, and this networks that are more horizontal or non-hierarchical, something that we practice in depth at NAAS. I wanted to pick your brains, maybe all of you, whoever feels called to answer this question, please, by show of hand. I think if we want to dissect a little bit the model of networks within NAAS, we are kind of obsessed with with the governance models and decision-making models. Rana, maybe you're very familiar with this and the way we try to do it at NAAS. I personally think that this practice in itself is cultural policy in the making. Is by practicing such tools, and you're using these tools and methodologies, you are by definition challenging, like more hegemonic neoliberal models that are existing. So I hear from Jowe that peer-to-peer digital technologies are possible. I personally don't know their name. I don't know what they are. Maybe you can comment a little bit on this, and maybe from Rana and Yazan we can hear a little bit more about the potentiality that exists in network thinking and in solidarities amongst institutions, but also amongst individuals and cultural practitioners. I don't know if my question is clear, if it's a little bit too broad. So I wanted to speak about the NAAS experience specifically. As I said, we are a network of more than 20 cinemas. So the way we think about allocating resources amongst ourselves, because NAAS is a grant-making institution also at the end of the day. We do issue grants and we distribute them amongst the cinemas. So we have looked into this model that takes a long time. It's basically a year long, and it's slow. It takes a lot of in-depth knowledge of one another, of the cinemas, getting to know each other in depth. And then it culminates at the end of the year with a meeting where all of the beneficiaries, I'm going to use this term even though I really don't like it, sit around the table and decide amongst themselves how they were going to allocate the sums based on their needs, based on the urgency, based on their in-depth knowledge of one another. That's an example, offline example that I have to offer. Anyone?
Seems no one have
Reflections on the
comments on
topic,
this,
or
please.
No,
ما اسمع رنا؟
I was كنت عم بسأل لو بدك comments على الموضوع ولا
Yeah, I mean, basically with the larger United Screens project, you know, that this session is part of, we are trying to draw a blueprint of possibilities of the, you know, maybe small success stories, relative victories, models that are more equitable, that work in solidarity, that we can be inspired from both offline and online, because the word technology is not necessarily relegated to digital technology, you know. So I was trying to maybe seek a small, more concrete examples, maybe dive a little bit deeper into you know, more anecdotal illustration of, you know, the values that we have been mentioning and talking about. So if anyone has anything to add, we have the 1 hour mark, but please, Yazan, go ahead.
yeah, and maybe I can just and I remember when Rana did an interview with me for her research on Khalil al-Sakakini. I think that was you know, there was a trial also to engage with an existing structure and try to shift it and to do shifts within the existing structures of cultural institutions. And I think in that moment there was this very urgent question: is like, you know, like we are equipped with critique of power. We are so much equipped with this kind of understanding of that critique, and you know, like and the power of the institutions and the structures, etc. But it rarely happens that that critique is put in action. And actually, it's actually the challenge is when you are in power, how do you practice that critique of power itself? No? So I think I would say in that period of the 4 or 5 years of Khalil Sakakini, what we tried was to use this structure to, on one side, to practice this critique, but at the same time to produce something out of this critique. For instance, we worked on providing health insurance, kind of to cultural practitioners, but also to expand the idea of the beneficiaries of and who are the cultural, who work in the cultural institutions. So how do you engage with not only the artists or the directors or the coordinators, but also on the whole structure of freelancers and the people who work within and through the cultural institution, but at the same time the non-cultural producers who also work in the cultural institutions, the technicians, the caretakers, I don't know which one, the cleaners, the whole community that lives out from the cultural economy. So we tried to expand the understanding of the cultural economy and to try to engage with all its factors and its um, agents that work in it and through it. So one of the examples was trying to provide health insurance as a way to engage with the big problem of health for sure, but also of securities within this field of cultural sector. Yeah, that's an example maybe.
Rana, please.
I think we're talking basically about reconsidering the governance and governing structures. We're talking about shifting powers and questioning what we consider transparent. We have tendency to stronger dynamics and stronger system of solidarity. We are looking at participatory approaches to grant making, or participatory grant making as we call it. I mean, all these, it's been tested in many different ways, techniques in the world. And I can give a very quick example of from Croatia, Cluster, which is a network of groups and institutions started with the vision of decentralized cultural sector in Croatia, and it has a history of 15 years, and they have experimented growing from bottom up. They didn't start at aiming at changing cultural policy in Croatia, but they achieved that. They were behind the establishment of the first public funding institution in Croatia that is solely responsible of supporting civil society organizations. I mean, it became kind of a movement, or this is how I see it. I see it as a movement more than an institution or a network, but it started by I think 5 institutions and groups from different cities in Croatia, and grown to more than 100. They all, for example, they have 2 grant scheme annually. Every time the 100 member of the network have to decide together who will get the funding, and every candidate, every applicant for the fund must, as a condition to be able to get the funding, must vote, must be part of the decision-making process. So contrary to all what we grew up with, talking about conflict of interest, for example, the whole idea of conflict of interest, governance and transparency, I think is something that we need to dive in. Let's not also forget that we, to some extent, had the concept of the European institution in the Arab region more than we have created something from the society and from the culture. So we need, I think it's not about the solidarity as is not an objective by itself. I mean, it's a form of not only survival but being. Being means being effective, living, and not only surviving. So we're at the stage where I think every practitioner in this region believes to some extent that we need to be more working together. We need to be more autonomous in our decision making, and we need to rethink and have this critical distance to what we know is right and wrong in the cultural system. So there are many examples also from India. I think we can share this later. The art institution in India that is always built on this participatory kind of funding models and governance models. There are many models in the world. We have Rawa funds in Palestine. It's new. It's in its second grant scheme only, so it's a new experience. We'll see where it goes, but it's also trying to work from the Palestinian society as the main decision maker in the process.
Yes, there is a question, Leil. Maybe, I mean, it's along the same lines. Maybe you'll be answering it with what you have to share. The question is, can peer-to-peer infrastructure be imagined, which is hybrid in nature? I'm assuming hybrid is online, offline. And what are the immediate pitfalls that we should avoid as we imagine this? But please say what you wanted to say.
Okay, so what I wanted to say is not related to this. I want to build on what Yazan and Rana mentioned about governance and the decision-making process, or the control buttons within the cultural production. If we look within the context of Arab majority countries, I think it's good if we're going to discuss governance to start with self-criticism, and I would start with myself, in the sense that the majority of the voices or the majority of the positions that are being held in the cultural production process are held by people who are predominantly white-passing, cis, heterosexual to a great sense, and on another level, the representation across the Arab majority countries, we have the countries that are predominantly also heading towards the white passing communities, rather than like seeing voices that are, for example, from Mauritania or from Yemen or from Sudan or from other countries that are not usually represented. So if you're going to talk about governance, especially in the funding process, I like the examples that Rana gave. I think we need to make the effort also to include people in the decision-making process. And this is where I think the digital could be very helpful. Taking into consideration, like, it is helpful, but also it's a bit critical, because also who has access to the bandwidth to participate, and all of this, and also the safety within their own countries to be able to participate in these conversations. This is what I wanted to add.
You actually answered the question, because it is, not reproducing inequities is one of the pitfalls when we try to imagine this peer-to-peer infrastructure. Jowe, did you want to add something? Okay. I wanted to actually. Oh. Yeah, no, please go.
Sorry, I think I'm quite delayed. If you look at what just definitionally a peer-to-peer network is that you have a network of different that are equally, privileged, equipotent. So, it's not just, obviously this is for use online. It's like a platform that people, have tried to make digitally, but I think it's perhaps even easier to take offline and just reproduce, socially in groups.
And yes, also, just to add to what Jowe, sorry, Jowe Harfouche, just to add to what Jowe was saying, in the sense that also there's a lot of criminalization, especially in the past 10 years, to peer-to-peer networks, whether in the digital space or in the offline space. And I think this should be taken into consideration. And this is, of course, is being like, every year it's being like the space is being tightened even more, whether it's copying stuff or sharing stuff. Even when the artists themselves, for example, want to share their stuff, it's the production companies or the copyright laws in each country that is deciding whether they can share their own work or not. So I think this also, we should keep this in mind when we're talking about peer-to-peer networks.
I wanted to add the exact same thing. I wanted to basically just contribute with another buzzword, which is civic space. And the possibility of civic space online. And you were talking about criminalization, for example, and Jowe mentioned a little bit, talked about censorship and surveillance that takes place online. My question is twofold. With the cinema members of the NAAS network, for example, it became immediate the need to address the question of, are we moving our cinema or film programming online or not? It was not an obvious choice to simply replicate the programming, the film programming that takes place within communities, within physical spaces of cinema, into online platforms, specifically because the mission and the vision of the NAAS members is this collective gathering, as a political action, like the presence of bodies together in one space as kind of a, in this moment, it's almost perverse to imagine it, really subversive move. But also what can be harvested in terms of critical thinking, in terms of dialogue around culture and arts. And with this move, with some of it being moved online, one of the pitfalls I see is this is what we would lose. The impossibility of what is commonly referred to as, civic space of action, perhaps cannot be reproduced online. How do you feel about this? Sorry, but before you go, Jowe, Yazan was speaking about digital place, not digital space, like something extremely punctual in time that also counters the infinity that the internet presents, and this overwhelming, what looks like a breadth of access is actually just an ocean of unknown. So if you can, both Jowe first and maybe Yazan, if you want to comment on this point.
In terms of cinema and cultural production, this move online and whether you can recreate the sort of political action of bodies in space. I think that's something that your collective will have to decide for itself. But in terms of just like the reality of what that might mean in terms of access, depending on the kind of content that you will be showcasing, producing on certain platforms. Like I've mentioned, I think, particularly in this region, which is, one of the most censored regions in the world, say for China, it's if you're investing so much time and energy into building a platform, and you're trying to reach an audience in a state that has a very robust censorship regime, all of that time and energy could just immediately be for naught if you don't have a correlated circumvention strategy. Because you can take a long time to build a platform, and the Egyptian government can just instantly censor it the moment that it's launched. And there are really creative strategies. A few years ago, around the Egyptian constitutional referendum, there was a political group that launched a very creative series of mirrors to get around the block. And obviously this was a very hyper-politicized event. The constitutional referendum was intended to extend term limits for the president, and these people were encouraging people to vote no, and the timeline was very, very short. But they basically had about 20 mirrors all lined up, and in this 10 days, the state and the activists, censored and then relaunched the same website about 25 times. So there are creative solutions that are based off of the publisher sides to get around these censorship possibilities. In addition to that, I think sort of other forms of digital security hygiene are really important as well, to make sure that those who may be tuning in, if it's more sensitive alternative content, that these folks won't experience any retribution depending on where they're watching it from.
And the space place thing, to be honest, I sometimes think, that there is something about the internet that's so overwhelming that you feel like it's so huge, so big that, like whatever you do, you're just throwing one dot in the, one drop of water in the ocean. And there's this kind of need to make it more palpable. What do you call? What's the word? Like more touchable, more something that you can actually imagine, that you can that you can scale it, no? Like you can imagine it in scale. But anyway, so this, I think one of the things about, I was talking about this, I think in relation to Radiohara, that this idea of like it's happening now and here and together, and this is again, like this sounds so old-fashioned, like listening to a radio together, but it's really something that we have lost in the media, in the media production, but also in the especially and online. Like the online, as if deletes this possibility of collectively listening, of being together, of this linear time that, like you tune in. If you miss the show, you miss the show. Like it might repeat a few days later, but you have to. You can miss it. It's not tailored for your own time and existence. No, like that's on one side, and the other one, which I think it's becoming like you produce all these, podcasts, music, but then it's left to you to create all this huge network of connections to tell the people about it, to have people listen to it. You have to all the time. You have to promote it. You have to show it. You have to share it. You have, like you want to create a network of people to listen to your production. And I began feeling that there's something happening on Radiohara because it's creating all this base of listeners and people that are engaging and following the program. That you are not alone facing the world with your production. Like you produce it. There is already a community that's there engaging with the platform, and you just need to put your production in the program. You don't need to promote it. You don't need to like there is a new podcast, a new show. The whole platform helps you already in doing this by design. No, like it's not like we are doing it specifically for this person or that person. It's just very simple act in the morning, and I think this is making Radiohara to really become, first of all, a hara, a neighborhood, and neighborhood not in its unscalable feeling, but in this very place and this kind of place, the intimacy of the place itself online, which is something that I somehow, like I'm beginning, again, like we are beginning to notice these things. We have no plan to do that. It's just like maybe we are putting language on something that we are feeling now. Maybe it's right. Maybe some people would say, no, it's still in that word of, it's still an ocean, but I feel it's the scale of the radio is it's only 24 hours and that's it. And that's already for the internet. It's something that's manageable for the individual scale. Yeah.
And Joey, to add to what you were saying about NAAS and the move to the digital, and to stop being pessimistic myself. I mean, we already had this conversation, you and I. For me, I would say, like with NAAS or with other collectives who are thinking about moving to the digital, I think three factors are quite important to consider, or at least these are the factors that I find important. First of all, the job security. And when I'm talking job security, I'm not talking, because when we talk about cultural workers, most of the time we tend to drop people who work in the physical space that are not the artists or the producers. I mean, you, Joey and Yazan, might know better about running a cultural center, which is people who are cleaning, people who work at the bar or at the cafeteria, all these type of workers that contribute to the functioning of a cultural space. That I think it's very important to keep them in mind when we're moving to the digital, and to understand that this move is momentarily now during the pandemic, but once we go back to normal, whatever normal is, we are not going to kind of like marginalize them from the process. The second thing is building on what Joey mentioned about being in a heavily censored zone. There's also the issue of data collection and the way governments use data collected about users in these countries, especially when we're talking in the sphere of culture production, or even watching movies. Like if we say we're gonna show a gay film, for example, or a lesbian trans film, whatever. Governments can access the data if we don't take it into consideration to protect user data in certain countries, and can profile people, and it could be used to crack down on them. So I think we should also be very careful when we're doing these type of things. And the third thing that I've been seeing quite a lot is when it comes to, for example, film festivals, is the issue of pricing of tickets. You see festivals, or most of them, they say, for example, it's €5 or whatever, $10 to attend this session. €5 for someone living in Berlin is not the same value for someone living in Cairo or living in Ramallah or living in Beirut now under the financial crisis. So I think once we move to the digital, we should also use technologies that are available to kind of make it more accessible, in the sense to give pricing according to geographical zone. Of course, I'm sure some smart ass will come and be, yeah, but people will use VPNs and they will be like tricking us and they will pay less. I prefer a few people trick the system and pay less than to marginalize a lot of people who would not be able to afford these prices.
Thank you, Leil. Rana?
Any of you is aware of the or know the actual number or percentage of internet users worldwide? I've checked that 1 year ago or something. It's around half of the globe population, less than the half. I mean, we're heading towards. I'm very skeptical when it comes to moving to digital for art spaces, cinemas, theaters in particular. There are many reasons for being very scared of this move. First is the new kind of centralization and exclusiveness that is created in the system. We've been talking for tens of years about the centralization of the arts in the cultural policy, etc. And now we are in. If we will use the term new reality, I mean it's a very centralized new reality, but in a different way than the way we know about. So this is one part. That the second thing, I think art and culture has changed a lot in history, from being in Su'awqat to being. I mean, it had many forms. It had many systems. It changed in economy, intellectually, etc. But it never, from what I'm aware of, it never stopped being a social experience as much as it is an aesthetic experience. I mean, I can't imagine theater online. I mean, I can imagine it just, yes, for a change, because we'll go back to theater in a year. But I mean, and then what will happen? We'll stop making theater. New art forms will be created or something. I mean, it's not as simple as we're moving a festival online. We are in a phase. I'm not able of analyzing what will happen, but forms will disappear, new forms will be there. Political situations pushed us to new online forms, for example, before even having to face the pandemic. But still, we were able to build on what we had. Now, are we really talking about this shift as something that must happen? And can we even discuss fairness or accessibility when we move online? Are we talking anymore about communities? We're already coming from countries where we have refugee camps. I mean, it's the reality that we come from. Even if I'm personally not living there anymore, but I'm still part of that system and will continue to be. And we have the question of migration and online and the move to the online. I mean, it's too complicated for me at this point to think of it as, yes, as a reality, as something that will happen or already happened.
Thank you, Rana. I want to say that we are officially out of time. We have crossed the 90-minute mark. So if anyone has a question from the people watching us, it's now or never. I have one comment from Sana Ahmad. I think it's a comment rather than a question, but it goes along with what you were saying, Rana, now. Hi, thanks to all the speakers. Just in terms of circumventing national laws and practices, in contrast to building a new alternative platform to reach a wider audience, one must see the political, economic interests of the respective platform, which is why it bends to these state governments. There are very clear material interests which make the online space, interests which allow the platforms such as Facebook, etc., to benefit from inequalities etched across the world. If anyone would like to comment on this, we will wait a few more minutes if other questions will emerge, and then we will.
I absolutely
Jowe?
agree. I think. Oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I just want to say quickly that I absolutely agree, and to add to what Sana, I'm sorry if I get the name wrong, is saying is also not only their interests when it comes to profit, but also their geopolitical interests and the way they are policing speech. I mean, especially from Arab majority countries, Palestine is a very good example of how the speech is being policed on these platforms. Western Sahara, for example, is a very good example of these type of situations. Another thing that building on what Sana said is that we have this understanding, this misconception that these platforms, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, they're public spaces. They are like spaces for a public debate. They are not public spaces. They're privately owned spaces, corporations where profit is the main reason. And we should keep this in mind when we're talking to them or we're talking about them. So that's it, and I'll leave it. Joey, I'm sure we'll have more to add.
No, I agree completely. And not only, so they both have, geopolitical interests in these countries, but then they also have a lack of an interest when it suits them as well. And I think we see this, with the proliferation of hate speech in this, that's like much under police than it should be in comparison to the US and Canada. If you look at, the sort of numbers of Arabic speaking content moderators, there's 15,000 in terms of Facebook, 15,000 Facebook content moderators worldwide. In terms of transparency, we have no idea how many of those are Arabic speaking. We have no idea, dialect breakdown. And, particularly when you're, in every state, you will sort of have these like troll farms that are state backed that will help to silence speech, political speech on these platforms. And so having good moderation is really important into, maintaining, social media as somewhat of a space for debate. And these resources are just not invested in this region, and there's just no transparency at all. We just don't have any of this data. I've tried to find out myself. I have failed time and time again. I think this question is really important and needs to be kept in mind.
I feel like this conversation is getting richer and richer the more we unpack and dissect. Hello, we have a new guest speaker. I wanted
Captain
also
That's all we have.
I wanted to add to the notion of data collection that Leil mentioned, and to relate it a little bit to cultural practices that we kind of hold as sacred, which are mapping, signing petitions online, publishing names and locations of collectives, or promoting collectives, sometimes for visibility's sake, especially more dissident, political, queer collectives. So to link that to data collection and to be mindful of these dimensions when we just issue a petition that collects names of people, or we issue a mapping project that maps out, I don't know, cultural institutions or cultural initiatives or artists in specific communities. And along these same lines, I wanted to ask you if you still have any final recommendations or practical takeaways for artists and cultural practitioners to keep in mind, to be mindful of as we navigate this fierce digitization moment. And let's consider this as maybe the last round of shares. So if you want to say something as a closing words, and then we wrap it up. Who would like to go first, please?
I can go first. Yeah, in terms of approach, I think it obviously depends. The specifics depend on the specifics of the project. So, I don't think we can give like very digital security advice at this point. But I guess as a general approach, privacy should always be by design, either in the project or in the technology, or in the workflow, and digital security as well. It can't be, you decide on a project and you execute it and then you think about these security factors. It needs to be iterative, and to be from the beginning, and it needs to be integrated into every step of the project, depending on what your goals and aims and tactics and strategies are. So yeah, in terms of the specifics, we would have to see what the campaign or the project is, but I guess as a general rule and as a general approach, privacy by design and digital security needs to be integrated into all aspects.
And to follow on that, I would say, for me, I always approach digital security taking lessons from the queer feminist movement and sex education. I don't preach abstinence, but I preach informed consent that is built on knowledge and equality. So first of all, if you're an institution, inform yourself about the threats. And the threats are not universal. Some of them are universal, but some of them are local and are related to the context. So invest a little bit of time talking to a digital security person in the country that you're going to work with to get their input on what are the risks and the threat in that particular country. And if you are a user, I don't know if I'm allowed to make a small ad for a non-profit organization, not a non-profit project. It's called Totem Project. You can find it online. I'm not involved with them. I got hired to write some of the guides with a group of people. It's specifically targeted to journalists, but it also works for cultural workers, also and artists. They're self-learning digital security and privacy guides. They're available in Arabic, and they're just recently been updated, some of the courses. I think it's a good place to start if you're a cultural worker, you move into the digital space, inform yourself. It doesn't take a lot of time, but it makes a big difference, especially in the countries that most of us come from or we are based in.
Perhaps ask a peer or be critical of any initiative that arrives to you, and ask more than one peer that works in the same field as you first. Rana?
Maybe I just say tune in to Radiohara. Yeah, it's at least not a data mining platform. I hope. I don't know. Like now, I'm worried. Maybe there's a plug in it.
This is where you should start,
bug in it.
Yazan, by checking the platform.
But in all cases, no, for sure it's not, because we are using a simple website that it's designed. So it's not. Now I'm scared not to do. I don't know. But yeah, we'll check. I think we'll check. But although I'm pretty sure it's not. But yeah, I mean, in all cases, I think many of the things that we are doing are coming from like we're just really trying to do things and then try to understand how they connect, and that sometimes sound a bit basic, but I think we need always to go back to these kind of positions and just really initiate from the position of of not knowing exactly what will happen, and keep on shifting and trying on the way. Yeah.
Thank you, Yazan. Hannah?
Very, very shortly, I have to say that I agree totally with Joe and Leil. I think number one at this for me is safety and security of the artist and the institution. You can't hear me. I know that we need to build our individual and institutional knowledge and internal systems in this regard. It's not for granted that institutions have the system, not only the knowledge. And then number two, I would say if we have to exist online to exist, in order to exist, so maybe we can think of it a second time. I mean, it's not the only way of existence. It should enhance our existence more than make it happen.
Thank you, Rana. I want to thank you all for your precious time, for your wisdom. I know that, and I'm sorry for eating up more from the time that we had allocated for this panel. I know most of you have been looking at screens all day, probably. So thank you, Rana, especially. Thank you for your patience. And I want to thank the Savvy team, Abhishek, Laura, Juan, Anna, Ranav, and Boiling Head Media for putting this together. I want to thank once again the NAAS team, Erika and Furat, and everyone who tuned in. And as I said, hopefully this will be subtitled to Arabic very platforms. And that's it. Thank you, everyone. Ciao.
Thank you.